We know that young people choose the careers they'll go into in part based on the debt load they have to carry and how much salary they have to earn to make up for that debt. So that's one of the areas that's a huge challenge. And teachers of color in high poverty and high minority schools are also more likely to report that biases and stereotypes limit their advancement. We're doing pretty well in terms of recruiting teachers of color. We're doing much less well in terms of retaining those teachers. And that's a function both of the schools that they work in, which are high-need schools, the experiences they have there, and the extent to which they've had the kind of preparation and mentoring that will enable them to feel confident and to stay. So on the agenda for capacity building, which Susanna mentioned earlier, and especially for equity, is getting a strong, stable, well-prepared supply of teachers and leaders in every school. I will pass the mic.
All right. Thanks everybody for being here. Lucrecia and I both wrote technical reports. Lucrecia and I both wrote technical reports regarding the education of English learner classified students. So we're just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. Let's see.
We need to just get out of the slide.
So the first thing that we want to say is that close to 40% of California's K-12 public school students come into school as English learners, 38%. So I think it's really important to think about this in the sense that these are not some small group of students in the state. This, like, how English learner classified students do in the state is how well the state does. It's literally almost 4 out of 10 students. So I think English learners need to be have a front row seat, and education, when we think about policy and finance regarding the education of English learners, it needs to really have a very central position at the table. And this morning, Susanna talked to us some about the achievement gap that English learners face, and we want to position that also as an opportunity gap, and I'll just talk a little bit about that. English learners in school have 2 core rights. The first right is to English language instruction so that they can become proficient in the English language. And the second is access to core academic content. And I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about that because increasingly we're seeing that a lot of English learners are not being provided with that access to academic content. And that has very serious repercussions for them as individuals and for us as a state. So some of the things that we see are that English learners tend to be tracked into low track classes, low level classes, remedial classes, non-college preparatory classes. They also are disproportionately excluded altogether from core academic content classes. So, many English learners will be placed, for instance, in, as I mentioned, all English learners need to have access to English language development instruction, and in California, we have decided that will be through both integrated and designated ELD. So English learners will be in a designated ELD class, but in some places they'll be placed into 2, 3, 4 designated ELD classes, and obviously that starts taking away room for core academic content instruction. So we see a lot of patterns in which English learners are not in an English language arts class, or not in a math class, or not in a science class. And this is a critical area that needs to be addressed in the state. And another way in which English learners face inequitable opportunities to learn is that through LCFF, English learners are provided an additional 20% of funding through supplemental funds, and then in concentration grants if there's over 55% of the population falls into one of the targeted groups. However, there is not a good mechanism in place to make sure that the funds that are targeted towards English learners are actually reaching English learners. And it's important in terms of funding to improve the opportunities and outcomes of English learners, it's critical both that those funds get spent on them and that they get spent in ways that are beneficial to them. And we see challenges in both of these areas. So when, in sum, when English learners are not provided equal opportunity to learn, we see these achievement gaps. We see these gaps in outcomes. And some important gaps have to do with standardized testing outcomes, but also importantly, graduation rates. So, there's research now that points to that when, if a student is not reclassified by a particular point in high school, they're actually less likely to graduate and less likely to attend college. So there are really long-term repercussions of English learner classification with regard particularly to opportunity to learn. So I'll pass it over to Lucrecia.
Thank you, Ilana. So one of the important factors of opportunity to learn has to do with teachers. And one of the things that we looked at in our report was how teachers were being prepared to teach English learners. And we know from the evidence base in the literature, not a big evidence base, but a solid sort of small body of research, that teachers of English learners need a special skill set, both in terms of their pedagogical skills, also in terms of their dispositions. And what we found is that, to sum it up, basically teachers didn't feel well prepared to teach English learners. So this is a very vulnerable population, as Ilana said. It is an important population in California. And the teachers, who are perhaps the most important school level factor that would affect those outcomes, aren't feeling like they have the right skill set. And this is particularly important for English learners because what we see in the data is that English learners are more likely to be taught precisely by novice new teachers right out of teacher preparation programs. We saw in our research that both at the preliminary, less so at the preliminary credential, more so at the clear or induction stage of teacher preparation, the state lacks key assurances that teachers have those skills and dispositions. There are very few sort of external assurance points where teachers need to demonstrate that they have the skill set to teach ELs as a diverse group, not as sort of a, tell me how you would draw a lesson plan for one EL. That is not the situation that a lot of teachers in high EL districts like LA Unified, for example, face. It's not just one EL, it's a diverse group. It's made up of newcomers. It's made up of kids who have been in schools for a long time. It's made up of kids that have various levels of English proficiency. So knowing how to teach that diverse group is not in any place that we found. In our review of teacher preparation, there are not key assurances there. And induction, which is where teachers go into the classroom and get coached to try out some of these skills and dispositions, we found it to be sort of a missed opportunity in terms of focusing on this population. Thank you.
Thank you much. Jennifer? Okay, great.
Yes. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit because my focus on equity or the equity implications in my paper are not so much about where we are currently, but thinking about what equity implications might be going forward, particularly since I'm sure everybody has heard we need more money in the system. And as the adequacy study, the professional judgment adequacy study found that the gaps between what districts have and what they need to reach the goals that we have for all students, those gaps are bigger in some districts than in others. So the idea of raising, what was it, $25 billion has raised questions about where that is likely to come from. My paper looks at the funding system, not just in terms of the LCFF and the allocations across districts, but where the revenue comes from. So we can think about the school finance system having sort of two pieces to it. And in California, we have a lot less of our revenue for schools coming from local property taxes and local sources in general than in other states. And so thinking about where additional revenue might come from, any of those conversations many of those conversations involve thinking about local revenue sources. while that is important, it's also equally important to remember that not all localities have the same ability and opportunity to raise funds. That is, the tax base, regardless of whether you're using a local income tax or local sales tax or local property tax, any locally based tax there's going to be a lot of variation in that tax base across the many districts in California. And so if we change policies so that it makes it easier for local districts to raise revenue for their schools through whatever means, we need to think about what the equity implications of those policy changes might be. So we know, for example, that the rules of Serrano and all of the court cases that have happened across the country still hold. Right, so we cannot have vast differences in the revenue available to districts that is tied to their property wealth, for example. And so any additional revenue that's raised from local sources, very likely we would need to think about how the state could equalize that so that districts that have less ability to raise locally are not disadvantaged relative to districts that have higher tax bases. And so even if we can raise additional revenue from local sources, there will still need to be additional revenue at the state level that could help equalize out those the differences across the localities. So I don't necessarily have answers for any of that, but I really think it's important as we have a conversation about raising additional revenue to be cognizant that even if we can change the current policy status of those restrictions at the local level, the state needs to be very aware of the additional revenue needed from the general fund to offset those potential variations. I'll leave it at that.
Wow. Okay, Morgan. Yeah, exactly.
These are like the most efficient academics I've ever seen in my life. Yeah, right. So I'm talking about something which seems to me relatively small by comparison to the important issues that these folks are talking about, which is the accountability system in California. And so my research team and I, including my graduate student Shira Korn, who's in the back, did research on the California School Dashboard, which is California's way of redesigning or rethinking school accountability. So this California way, briefly, I think, can be decomposed into three main components. So a large increase in spending with a redistribution of those resources towards more disadvantaged school districts. A major relaxation or basically complete destruction of consequences in terms of rewards and sanctions for schools that don't live up to standard, and the use of multiple measures and the move away from API and AYP, which were based really primarily on, or exclusively on test scores. So we looked at the dashboard. We used three different sources of data. We looked at the dashboard data themselves. We looked at data from a poll of California voters and parents conducted by USC Rasier and PACE. And we looked at data from interviews with 91 California state superintendents, school district superintendents. So there are some good things about the dashboard in terms of both overall and specifically as pertains to equity. So on our poll, we found that those who are aware of the dashboard like it, and those who aren't aware of the dashboard, when we showed them the dashboard, they liked it. Which actually surprised me quite a lot. It was, I would say, the most surprising finding on that entire poll. People were generally enthusiastic about the idea. They were also pretty enthusiastic about multiple measures. To be sure, about half of parents said that they also, or instead, would like an overall grade for schools, which the dashboard doesn't currently provide, but API did provide. And so that's one area where the state might think about. If the state doesn't do it, then you're just going to have folks going to great schools, I think, and using great schools as their overall evaluation of school performance. Another good thing is that the dashboard includes many more students from subgroups due to the reduced N size. So under the old system, the N size was 100, and it's now down to 30. So just as an example, the number of schools, the proportion of schools that are now held accountable for an African American subgroup went from 14% under the old system to 34%. For an Asian subgroup, went from 18% to 38%. And for students with disabilities subgroup, went from 36% of schools to 84% of schools. And many more students are now visible. So the percent of students who were excluded from subgroup accountability has decreased quite substantially. So again, as an example, under the old system, 39% of African American students weren't included in an African American subgroup because there weren't enough African American students in their school to constitute a subgroup. And now it's 13%, so 39 to 13. For Filipino, it's from 64 to 31. For multiple races, it's from 80 to 27. And for students with disabilities, it's from 38 to 3. So many more students are visible under the current system in terms of being included in subgroups. That said, in terms of what's bad, if you actually go to the dashboard, I think, and you just look at it, now I'm referring to the old dashboard, not the redesigned dashboard, which we haven't yet had an opportunity to really look at, that subgroups aren't so visible on the actual dashboard itself. So even though their scores are reported, you have to dig and go deep into the system to find out how the different subgroups are doing. It's not a system that's especially well set up for a parent who wants to do something like look at how a student like my child would be expected to perform in this school. And schools can really earn overall strong grades with relatively weak subgroup performance. Another bad thing that we found was that awareness and use of the dashboard is very low, especially for voters and parents. But even use of the dashboard is pretty low for superintendents. We found about 12% of voters and about a third of parents said that they had visited the dashboard, which you would imagine that's a high, that's probably an overstatement. And we also found potentially troubling gaps with low-income voters about half as likely as more affluent ones to say that they have been to the dashboard. Superintendents feel very little pressure to improve from the state, so they say they feel pressure to improve, but that pressure comes from parents in the community and not from the state. Only 9 out of the 91 superintendents who were interviewed said they felt pressure from the state to improve. And there's really limited ability to use the dashboard to compare, and again, as I said, to say, how does a student like my child, how is that student expected to perform in this school? And so I think that makes it quite not so useful from the standpoint of parents for helping them inform choices or for helping them pressure for improvements. And so I think that said, one of the things that we struggled with in writing the paper was trying to understand exactly what the purpose of the dashboard was intended to be, who was it intended to serve, and it wasn't exactly clear from what the state was saying on its website and et cetera, who the dashboard was really intending to serve. If it is intending to serve parents, it's not really well designed for that purpose. But it didn't seem like it was really well designed either for superintendents because they were saying that the data were often too old or too coarse or potentially had errors, which I couldn't verify whether that was true or not, to be useful for them.
Thank you, Morgan. Okay, thank you, Morgan, again. Well, folks, I think we should turn to questions and comments from the rest of you. And let me first just throw it open to the floor, and my colleague, Hayan Kimner, will bring a microphone to you. And if you could also, in addition to identifying yourself, I'm going to ask you what, in your personal view, is your highest priority equity issue, if you were forced to just name one. Sir.
Hi, I'm Stephen Blake with Children Now. I have a question for Drs. Umansky and Santabanez, and perhaps with a follow-up from Dr. Darling Hammond. So we've talked a great deal about, over the years, about the shortage of teachers to serve underserved populations. In your slide, you described not only skills and knowledge that are needed, but dispositions. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and then perhaps Dr. Darling-Hammond, if you have some comments about dispositions that are needed for reaching other kids that are currently underserved populations. And given, sorry, long question, given the challenges we already have with these shortages, how do we ensure that kids can be reached by people with those dispositions? How do we develop those in people? How do we find more people that have those dispositions?
And your highest priority?
Oh my.
Yeah.
So I think it would be the identification and reaching kids with these, getting qualified teachers for these students, I think is the fundamental priority.
Okay.
Thank you. And I bet Linda has way more to say about this than I do. But let me just say the things that we were looking at in our technical paper. The dispositions that we highlighted there and that are sort of what you can glean from the literature have to do with teachers adopting an equity stance, being inclusive in the classroom, having an asset-based mentality where they see the unique set of skills that English learners bring to the classroom, including speaking another language as an asset, and that also know how to connect with parents and engage families in a variety of ways and not make sort of assumptions or whole prejudices based on how these families are able to interact and sometimes not interact with schools. And so what we found is that those dispositions we know are pretty important, but there were something that is emphasized at the preliminary stage, for sure. There are students that go through preliminary courses have to take courses that are related to this. In induction, we didn't see that much of an emphasis on sort of developing those dispositions. Admittedly, it's kind of hard to observe and measure and keep track of, but they're definitely very important in terms of making English learners feel like they belong in the classroom and that they can succeed. I'll let Linda talk more about the shortage issue and how to reach these populations.
Well, I'll also speak to the dispositions issue. I'm a strong believer that dispositions are related to knowledge and skills. You can pump people up with mantras like all children can learn and I believe, et cetera. But if you don't have the knowledge and the skills to actually help kids learn, those beliefs vanish. And we watch teachers who thought that their enthusiasm would carry them through, turn on the children, turn on the families, and start to blame them for their own lack of capacity. So I think dispositions are important, but they come about in part because teachers know a lot about, for example, how to teach students who are English learners in untracked classrooms. One of the reasons we have an ESL ghetto in a lot of schools where kids are not getting access to content and they're not getting access to the college preparatory curriculum is because it takes greater skill to teach kids in an integrated fashion. There are those skills. People can learn them, people do learn them, but where they're missing, we tend to get more tracking. Then what happens once you've got the tracking is that when you have shortages, you've got people coming in with no training at all, who do they get allocated to? They get allocated to the kids who have the least voice and the least clout, and the parents who have the least voice and least, so that just exacerbates, the inequality. So to get to a place where kids really have the kind of teaching that they need, we need teachers who are universally prepared to teach a wide range of kids who learn in diverse ways from different language backgrounds with a range of those teaching strategies. Those teachers also have to be aware of issues of implicit bias and of the social identity threats that kids may experience in marginalized groups and be proactive in dispelling the stereotype threats and in creating that sense of belonging, identity, that the students need also to put forth the effort. And I think that gets translated into dispositions. It gets translated into the disposition to teach all kids to keep figuring out what's needed when the first thing doesn't work. But the disposition ultimately rests on the right kind of knowledge and skills.
Before we take the next question, can I ask, anybody who cares to speak to it, whether you, your view about the adequacy of the licensure and regulatory framework with respect to its ability to produce the kinds of teachers that you're describing.
I have the same word. It's a personal question because because I chair the credentialing commission. We've been working on it. I think it's hard to get everything done through regulation, and one of the things that Lucia found in her work was that we don't, for example, in our performance assessments, evaluate as fully or deeply as we might the capacity that teachers have for teaching English learners. So I think that's an appropriate piece of the puzzle. But we have been very, very proactively for the last 7 or 8 years working to deepen that knowledge and skill set in many ways. For one thing, we've got greater and more clearly articulated expectations for how teachers will know how to teach English learners, and we have a new credential for teachers of newcomers, which we didn't have before. The assumption was if you had clad light, as some people would call it. There used to be a bilingual credential. It got folded into the regular credential, which means that in a lot of programs it got treated in one day in one practicum, course. And then there was an in-service version of it that was very, very minimal. So we have re-strengthened the set of competencies that are expected of teachers in pre-service. We have created a credential for the teachers of newcomers in English language development credential. We didn't have one of those. We have infused a great deal more training in the expectation for this kind of skill set, and both clinical and coursework for interns who could go in and teach English learners with nothing previously, and now they have to have more pre-service preparation for that. We've also, in the sense, we've infused Common Core knowledge for teachers and leaders, but we've done a lot around social emotional learning and development, around restorative practices, around creating a kind of a whole child knowledge base that teachers need, not just of their content and not just of the pedagogy tied to the content, but knowledge of the learning and development of the child. I could go on, but High-End is standing up, so I'm going to stop now. There's more to do.
Dennis Myers with California School Board Association. So for priority, obviously funding, but funding spent wisely. All right, so to answer your question. All right, over to Morgan. When you talked at the beginning about the dashboard, you talked about how parents generally liked it. They liked the look and the feel, but then you closed with it's not useful to parents. So is it a fact that parents, once they familiarize where it is and what's in it, they like it, and we can do more to improve that? Or are you saying there's just nothing in it for parents to help pressure the decisions to be made correctly locally?
Yeah, I think that, so first of all, our poll can only be so creative in terms of how it asks the questions. So, we did ask questions like, we asked first, are you aware of it? And then if they said they were, we asked if they liked it. And then we also showed them pictures of it and asked them if they liked the pictures. I don't think there's any, if you look at the pictures, I'm not sure why you would look at the pictures and say you didn't like it. So that is to say, it doesn't seem like that there's a lot of animosity among parents towards the dashboard right now. I think if anything, people are favorably inclined towards these kinds of things. But in terms of the utility, it's clearly not especially useful insofar as very few people said they used it. Now, it could be that if more people used it, they would find it useful, but I don't think that that's right. It's just, if you look at the dashboard, it's not set up in a way to be especially useful to parents. I think the most obvious reason for that is that there's no clear way to compare schools, and even a set of 2 schools you can't really compare in any reasonable way without doing a lot of clicking back and forth, and that sets aside all the other issues with how the data are presented. So
Morgan, excuse me, is that intentional in your judgment?
It would be surprising. It would be surprising to me if it wasn't an intentional decision to not make it easy to compare schools. So I think that basically the dashboard is not intended for parents. There was a system previously, the API, that parents used, and the API had lots of problems. And I might say I didn't even like the API, but they had something to use. And now I don't think that the state gives them really anything to use. And so that's why I said I assume that most parents, if they want to do this kind of thing, just go to grade schools, which rates all schools 1 to 10 and makes it very easy.
There's a lot of real estate in this room. It's hard to. Does anyone have a question?
While you're walking over there, I wanted to add one point to what Linda said. I think that there's also room for demand-side approaches to trying to bring in the kinds of teachers that we need. Targeted incentives to teachers who have the kinds of skills that we want, incentives to get them in and to keep them in, and I'm sure that I'm sure that many districts would like to be able to do those things, but are unable. And I think we should think about both supply side and demand side solutions to that problem.
This, I think, any of you can address.
Yeah,
Why do you think so little attention?
Who are you, Mark?
I'm Mark. I'm Mark Rosenbaum. I'm with Public Counsel in Los Angeles.
And your priority is?
Litigation. Why? So I'd like to say to each of you defendants, why do you think so little attention is paid to trauma and the impact of trauma in each of the areas that you're looking at? And what would you recommend to deal with it? And I guess the answer to your question, Chris, at the beginning is, I think the biggest equity issue is the intentionality when it comes to not caring about these kids, because the data is stunning, but I don't think anybody in this room is surprised at the basic conclusions, nor are they terribly new conclusions, except as they continue. So I think it's the lack of real interest or concern about kids who are being treated as disposable.
No, I'm just weeping.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought it up, because we're at a moment in this country where we are engaged in aggressive neglect of our children, and 46 million kids every year experience, some kind of adverse consequence. Of course, we know the range of poverty, homelessness is increasing, food insecurity, health insecurity, and so on. So one answer, immigration, oh yeah, the trauma that, the deportation and all the rest of it. It's a horrible time in terms of the way in which children are kind of viewed and treated. And there's, one whole conversation that's not had that the country needs to have about another war on poverty, about really a social safety net reinstitution and reestablishment, et cetera. That's not likely to happen until 2020. Maybe it would start then, but beyond that, when we're dealing in education, we've got to think about how to help address those concerns. And some states and some districts are really working on, some cities, on community schools models, on wraparound services, integrated student supports of various kinds that directly address the question of how do you help kids at least be able to come to school ready to learn. As we think about the funding system in California, I'm reminded of what New York is doing. One of those states that has reduced gaps significantly from that little slide that I geeked out on earlier. They have, as part of their formula for every high poverty district, 200 plus of them, a community schools allocation. And it is by formula. It is not something you have to apply for. They have a way by which they're supporting those districts also with technical support to create context within which kids will get healthcare, mental health services, food, social work supports, and the rest of the things that at least help to mitigate the trauma that exists in so many communities. And by the way, that also helps retain teachers. Teachers actually become both more effective and more likely to stay when that set of services is available.
Oh, okay.
Can I just say really quick, along those lines, I'll just throw out there that because education is such a huge share of the general fund budget, it's often seen as competing with a lot of other state priorities. And yet, if we really think about health and welfare services, some of the funding that goes to health and welfare services might have a bigger bang for your buck if those services were distributed at school sites or in connection with education, so that rather than thinking about these as competing priorities, it would be more useful to think of these as partnerships or potential partnerships to be able not just to deliver services more efficiently, but to have sort of a bigger benefit in the long run.
Okay, so now I feel a little bit compelled to talk about this issue some more. First, Mark, in response to your question about prioritization, there are a couple of things. One is that the fiscal constraints deter people from taking some of these issues seriously. And when I say fiscal constraints, what I really mean is political constraints. A second is that the research base that clearly establishes the neuroscience and human development mechanisms by which chronic stress and trauma, adversity, have an impact on brain and brain function in ways that influences learning. That research base, I think, has been developing over the last few years and is now quite solid, with implications for practice and ultimately implications for policy. And those implications in particular include the importance of services provided by people other than educators, usually by places other than schools, and often from budgets like health budgets or housing budgets that have more zeros in them than school budgets. So our challenge going forward, I think, in helping with this problem is to get the issues of student success from early childhood on up, and how best to provide the supports, the interventions to boost student success. That challenge needs to be baked into the missions, not just of schools, but of all these other critical child-serving agencies and youth development organizations. And when I say baked into their missions, I also mean baked into their budgets and reflected in accountability systems that make all of those organizations, not just schools, accountable for doing what they should be doing to deal with the whole child. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. That's a big agenda. Actually, Linda and I are partnered with AIR on a project to work on those issues in several jurisdictions around the country and ultimately on a national basis, how to do what I just said. The second observation I want to make is that that helps, I think, explain some of the priority issues, is my favorite New Yorker cartoon ever. I mean, in my life, which was sometime in the late 60s, mid to late 60s. And the cartoon has a picture of kind of an old, slightly rotund white guy with thinning hair sitting behind a big desk. He looking kind of like Dean Rusk, for those of you who are old enough to remember Dean Rusk. So he's sitting there, and on the desk there are 3 boxes. One says in, another says out, and the third one says too hard, right? And it just stretches up toward the ceiling. And there is, I believe, a natural tendency that when you have a complicated agenda, you tend to focus on things that aren't too hard. They're things where you believe you have a good chance of doing something useful, doing something significant. So, and that I say with respect to people who have the best motives, best intentions. Hard stuff is hard. The third and final point I'd make here is that we're not only in a political prison when it comes to some of these issues, we're in an ideological prison that I think of as the romanticism of localism. Now, if you accept the cliche that quality education is a civil right, your next sentence should be, and we know that civil rights challenges have rarely in American history been handled locally, have rarely been handled locally. The political accountability that we like flowing from localism also means that when the politics work against the interests of the disadvantaged, local is not likely to bring you all the solutions you need, as well, citing Jennifer, unlikely to give you the resources that you need. So those are my 3 points in response, Mark, to your question about why we're not doing what so obviously needs to be done. And I should add to that, of course, that so many of this problem of quality, of equity, et cetera, is racialized. And they're just brown kids, they're not my kids, is probably something that feeds into the prayers of a lot of folks every evening. Yes, where's Han? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you for those comments. My question actually follows from that. I'm Karen Manship at AIR. In terms of priorities, what I'm really concerned about, I didn't grow up in California, and so having lived here for a while, what really strikes me is how many tiny little school districts there are instead of having broad countywide school districts, and that seems to be a real source of inequity. And so I wonder if any of you think that California will ever take on that question of sort of this segregation in schools and districts and our tiny little systems of separate and unequal schools and districts.
There are certainly folks in California who would like to encourage consolidation of districts. If it's going to ever happen, and there, will have to be by incentive probably. I've seen over many decades, many a politician do a kamikaze mission around district consolidation. So it would have to be, I think, probably incentivized. Counties do give you the possibility to create more equitable both funding and greater desegregation and so on, but also working with county school districts, which are common in the South, common in some parts of the East Coast. That's not so simple either. And the same dynamics and racism that operate in the little districts or the divides that occur because of little difference, can also happen in counties. So if we were to try to move in that direction, we would have to do it with an additional explicit agenda around that. I'm watching in North Carolina right now, and Texas and other places as little white enclaves secede from their counties. And we've watched for many decades as county systems have allocated resources inequitably. Not always, and there are real possibilities for greater equity in a larger system district, but we shouldn't assume that it will get rid of the underlying dynamics that are also at issue.
Good afternoon. My name is Shiloni Cruz Gonzalez, and I work for Californians Together, but I'm also a local school board member. So I have two quick questions. One's quick.
And your priority is?
Oh, and my priority is addressing the gaps in outcomes for our students. I don't want to call them achievement gaps, opportunity gaps, but those gaps. I have a question for Jennifer. So in your report, you talk about in Texas that like the equivalent of the basic aid districts, there's a maximum amount of money that they're allowed to keep, right? As opposed to California, where they get to keep all that money. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you see it being applied to California? And then my other question, can I just do the other? Yeah. So then my other question is actually probably more of a comment, and that is, as a local board member or in my position with work, I've been able to read a lot of LCAPs, right? And so what I don't see is a connection to decisions that are being made about money connected to the great research that is highlighted in your reports, that are highlighted in the research that comes out of LPI. And so the question is, how do we make sure that our decisions are being driven by all this great knowledge that exists on the research side but doesn't translate into action in districts?
So let me explain about the Texas system really quickly. They have something called recapture. Texas's system is a lot more complicated than ours now that we've moved to LCFF. They have multiple tiers, so they have a foundation formula that's similar to LCFF. On top of that, they have an equalized system if districts choose to tax themselves at higher rates, and basically if districts are raising too much money or over certain limits, part of that gets recaptured by the state and redistributed. So there's it's not that they can't choose to raise additional funds for themselves, but essentially the price for $1 goes above $1, right? If they want to raise additional funds, they have to raise more than they really want because the state is going to claw back some of that. It is, I was just talking to somebody at lunch. I have no idea how they passed it. It is incredibly unpopular in Texas, but it only affects a relatively small percentage of districts, I believe. I don't know the exact percentage or the number, but it is very different than what we do here, right? Basic aid districts are those that, because their property values go up, they get additional revenue. It goes above what they would otherwise get allocated from the state, and so they get to keep all the excess. That actually is something to keep in mind when you see comparisons about like the overall distribution of revenues across the state. LCFF is one thing, but there's lots of other places that districts get revenue. So when we start talking about the total amount of dollars available to any given district, that total per pupil amount is not nearly as progressive, even as LCFF would be, because of things like the basic aid districts. So any additional, recapture or some form of recapture would be one way to help equalize any additional funding that came from additional local revenue sources. It would not be popular, but that doesn't mean we don't do it.
And on the last point about LCAPs and the lack of connection to research and evidence base, first of all, there is a research paper in the Getting Down to Facts package, at least one. Yeah, yes, Julie Marsh's. That talks about some of the shortcomings of the LCAP process, which are perfectly predictable. But I will say that in our work at the Opportunity Institute, and I think Linda has seen the same in her work, it is very clear that one of the important things is that that everyone at the table in the LCAP process have sufficient kind of intellectual capital, background understanding to ask the most important questions and offer valuable suggestions. And with that as the goal, we have to recognize that there are huge capacity problems completely around the table on that. That is, that there are capacity problems in most districts and certainly among most NGOs, parent leaders, et cetera, and overcoming those capacity problems so that they know what evidence there might be or what examples, good and bad, there might be relevant, requires an investment of resources, which can be done collaboratively so there are economies of scale across districts, but it doesn't happen without a lot of intentionality. I think just as LCFF was being adopted, I remember we had a convening of researchers and advocacy folks at Berkeley to ask about research questions, and one of them was, how do you develop a system of public engagement that is better than lets everybody who's interested show up in the high school gym on Thursday at 6 p.m. and speak into the mic. The principle, I think in How to Be a Principal 101, you're taught how to manipulate an audience to allow you to avoid the hard questions and to make them feel good no matter what the real situation is. So that's in How to Be a Principal 101. And that problem and the problem of capacity have to be overcome if LCAP is going to deliver on its promise of changing the local politics of opportunity. Full stop. Remember, it's a hypothesis that kind of public engagement would have an impact on student outcomes. Just a hypothesis. And following up on Julie's work in the years ahead, we have to see whether or not it's a complete flop or just a partial flop. Morgan?
And if I can be extremely crass and self-serving, but also potentially serving of education in the United States. So I just recently wrote a short piece for Brookings about this very issue of connecting research to policy, to folks who need to make decisions, which is like LCAPs. And we proposed a new model, and we've just received our first funding generously from AXA to give it a shot, but we're looking for more funding to actually try this thing. And I think that I'm not saying that it's going to solve the problems, and it might be a complete flop or a partial flop, but it's something that I think is really squarely aimed at connecting researchers directly to the questions that are emerging from policymakers, people who need to make decisions, as opposed to the way we typically think about things, which is, what evidence can I bring to you, and then how can you use my evidence?
There is a supply problem and a demand problem, right? Because I think there's good reason to expect that even if the supply of useful research builds, the demand for it, the use of it by policy influencers will be disappointing unless something additional is done. There's lots of talk in ESSA and in state plans around the country about making policy choices based upon evidence, based upon research, right? Evidence backed this and that. But by and large, there is no infrastructure for delivering evidence to decision makers. We don't require that critical policy decisions by school boards, by administrators, be peer-reviewed, for example. Just what do others think about the policy choice you're making, or is it sufficient for you to just operate based on politics and intuition without evidence? So George W. Bush's two best speech lines: mission accomplished, and the soft tyranny of low expectations, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Okay, so I think those low expectations, that's where we are in terms of expecting evidence-based decision-making by school officials. We're the folks who can design ways to overcome that. Let me just ask our panelists if anybody has any closing thoughts. Well, I'm sorry. I can fix my phone. We have 5 minutes. No, seriously.
I wrote down "Hard Stuff is Hard," Chris Edley, 2018.
Yeah.
But
there's a lemma that goes along with that, which is that there are more hard jobs than there are good people.
Okay, so on a more positive note, I just wanted to say, kind of on a more positive note, that, those 10 years ago or a decade ago when we did the first Getting Down to Facts study, it was all about how messed up the system was. And there was no indication back then that getting something like the local control funding formula put into place was a remote possibility, even though we've been complaining about the system for decades before that. So I guess the positive spin I'd like to put on all this is that there are things that are really, really hard that are possible. You just may need to complain about them for 30 years before they get changed, but it doesn't mean you stop complaining.
Amen. That's a good closing note. Don't stop complaining, right? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you especially to our panelists.